Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Mastering Dungeons. I'm Shawn Merwin here with my effervescent co-host Teos Abadia. Hey Teos.
Hey, Shawn, how are you doing today, my friend?
I am doing. There was a weekend. Time has changed. We are time travelers, not of our own volition, but it has been forced upon us.
Yeah,
I have fallen back and I am ready to go.
fantastic, fantastic. I have fallen, I have gotten up, and this weekend I got a lot done. I also did a lot of trying to check out other social media options, and that was well, it took me back to the early days of Twitter, really.
Yeah, it's just so you know, the show is going to stay on Twitter for now. Although we are, as Teos said, checking out alternatives in case the little blue bird catches fire and flames out. But
Yeah.
and
Eh,
we also had big news last week, and continuing news of going indie. Last week was our first independent show, and we could not be happier with the support we've received, both in terms of people who have joined our new Patreon, as well as people who have just said that they really enjoy the show and that they're looking forward to continuing listening and watching us. So thank you all for all the support that we've received.
yeah, thank you so much.
Okay,
Shawn.
so let's jump right in to talking with our listeners out there with our Tweetbag and Patreon missives. Our first comes from Twitter, and it's George PR at Unordinary Tales. George PR asks, "Do y'all play other RPGs besides 5e D&D? If so, what games and what do you think D&D does well?" So, yes, I can speak for myself by saying I do play other role playing games. I don't play as many as I'd like to, and I don't play them as often as I'd like to, but I do. How about you, Teos?
Yeah, I love playing other games other than 5e. In fact, I miss doing it as much as I have at some points in my life. I used to be in a group in Pennsylvania where every time we met, we would play a different game. And that was amazing for me to just learn the breadth of what is offered out there and understand how vastly different mechanics can be between games and how similar. So yeah, I miss that. But you know, like at Gamehole Con, I played some Shadowrun, I played some other games. So yeah, I'm a big fan of other things. What what do I think D&D does well? I think D&D is very simple and rewarding compared to many of the more complex games. So like if you take like a Shadowrun or other games that try to be beefy, Eclipse Phase, things like that, D&D handles it really well. Its complexity is sort of like outer layers of the inner core rather than you having to learn a lot of different things. And so it tends to be pretty easy to do what you want to do. And the D20 carries a lot of weight, so it's pretty simple for players to understand, pretty easy for them to say, I want to try a thing, and then the D20 reflects that without really having to link it to a lot of subsystems. I think D&D does that pretty well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think D&D 5e has that happy medium, as you said, Teos, between a game that is very, very complicated and detailed and has a lot of latency between saying what you're going to do and getting to the point. Latency, the latency in D&D can be cut to a minimum by just, what do you want to do? Okay, roll a D20. We'll add those numbers quickly and we'll get to the resolution and to the story that
Yeah.
flows from that. But it can also be made very complicated for people that like that. It can be made a very tactical game that gets down into the nitty gritty of adding different numbers and using tactics to influence the mechanics and then therefore influence the narrative. So it can be adjusted. There are many dials that can be turned quite easily for an experienced game master who can do that. So I think that's where 5e has its strengths.
Yeah.
And then other games you can then get into, well, we want to go more tactical. So is there a more tactical game that doesn't have some of the drawbacks that D&D has when it's made tactical, or more free-flowing story will move in that direction, and there are games that do that better. And that's sort of what I've been doing with games recently. It's not just role-playing games, but even with board games and light role-playing games. And to see where that line between a mechanical game and a storytelling game can be blurred, and experiment with the latency and with the storytelling flow of those. So, like, I've been playing The Initiative by Unexpected Games, which is sort of a board game, puzzle game, and ongoing story that you can play in about 20 minutes to 30 minutes. So it's a board game, not quite a role-playing game, but you can get that sort of story element. Alice is Missing from Spencer Stark. Is that great? The game itself, played via text message, right, tells a story without having to roll up a character and get into that sort of thing. Alone Among the Stars is a solo role-playing game, journal game, where you can roll some dice, draw a card, and then let your creativity flow out of that by yourself in a journal. So, all of these games have these lessons that you can learn and ways that you can incorporate them if you want to either make your own game or take 5e and go off in a different direction with it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really fascinating to see also how games advance. Like, I was thinking about at GameholeCon, I played Shadowrun and I played Alien, the role-playing game. And they both have this sort of like, I roll to attack, you roll to sort of soak or deny the damage. And one of the problems of that is that you can end up with a situation where you did a lot of rolling and it all felt sort of exciting, but at the end of it, nothing happened. And that can happen several rounds in a row, right? And Alien tackles that a little differently in that your rolls matter because you're making these rolls that have the possibility of adding stress. And stress gives you more dice, which gives you more chances to have the thing you want, but also to then trigger things that the DM wants, which are going to be horrible and terrible for you. And that mix is really quite fascinating. So it's neat how to look at that game and see, wow, they kind of put this really kind of indie storytelling piece that is in the normal steps in a more complex, dense game. And that's really fascinating how that works out. Yeah.
Yep. And what you might find if you do play a lot of games is you like a game to play as a one-shot, or you like a game that maybe once a month or once every 2 months or 3 months that it's fun to play this game. But if you played it every week or multiple times a week, it would get tedious because of all of the latency that's involved in it. So, it's good to play, especially like with a group, if you have your normal home group, to try a different game with them every once in a while, just to appreciate something different, but also appreciate what you already have.
Right. Like, I love running like a one shot of Time Watch, right? That can be a really absurd, fun game where you're zipping around time and undoing things. And some of the adventures are just hilarious, right? It's Bill and Ted type stuff, and it can be serious, right? But a lot of the best ones for me are those that are really sort of humorous and absurd, and you're doing funny things to resolve it. And that just changes up the tenor of a home group, and then you can go back to whatever you're doing, right? And for me, same, dipping into horror. Like, I don't really like deep horror as an overall kind of thing. So going into that for a bit is a really fun change to me, and then I can go back to my typical D&D campaign.
Sure. Absolutely. So we have one other comment that we got via email. It was actually quite an in-depth comment from Alex Kammer. Alex is the person behind GameholeCon and behind Gamehole Publishing. And he wanted to talk about what we talked about when we recorded our live podcast at GameholeCon, specifically talking about running a fulfilling campaign. And why this is important, I think, is because Alex and his group have been playing at the Gamehole for over 20 years with,
Wow.
with the same group. Yeah, and like I think back, 20 years is when I got back into D&D with 3rd edition. So, my whole experience as a role-playing game designer and freelancer has been in this time where Alex has been running this game with his group at the Gamehole.
It's incredible.
And so, do you want to touch on some of the things he talked about, Teos?
Yeah, he shares how he has 7 total members, so 6 potential players at any one time. And that touches on what Mike Shea had recommended of having more players than you have to have, so someone can cancel and you're fine. So Alex and his group, they'll send out a Google survey every 6 weeks where everybody can indicate what nights they can play, and then they plan ahead for that. And they usually have 5 players, sometimes 4. So that's the whole idea, right? You have 7 total players, but you end up with 5 or 4, and therefore you can play and you don't have to cancel. And there have only been a few times when they've not had enough positive responses in a given week to play, and that usually involves holiday travel and obvious times like that. His group also switches GMs. They have at least 3 people who are glad to jump in and DM, so that lessens the load and provides breaks for that main GM. And then they do, I enjoyed this, he talks about their level of maturity and says that they have a recap after every gaming session, which they lovingly call a recrap. And so they summarize in their recrap. He says, in it, we not only summarize the events, but we highlight good plays and usually award a POD to satisfy your sports requirement. The recap is great, or recrap is great, as it saves time for both the DM and players before the next session, as everyone can reread it right before we game and everyone's ready to go. Also, it often fosters discussion about the last game in the days that follow the actual game itself.
Yep.
And he also looked at metagaming.
Talked about right. And so he talked about metagaming, and his group works to keep focus on the action. So when it's someone's turn, they focus on the action at hand and don't get overly involved in discussing tactics. Their line is, this fight actually is happening right now. What is your action? So you don't have the time, your character does not have the time to sit and discuss where everyone is standing or what would be the best spell to cast at this moment. Just do the thing, which I really like. I think is it's good in keeping the action flowing.
Yeah, that's a smart move.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks, Alex.
So,
thank you, George.
Yep. And if you would like to ask a question, we will tell you at the end of the show how you can do that. But let's get into our news and commentary section. Big, well, not quite huge news on the D&D movie, but we'll say about 28 days worth of news is that the D&D movie is being pushed back in the release schedule by those 28 days. It was supposed to be released on March 3rd, and now it will be released on March 31st. So what's being released in its place? The movie Scream 6. Yes,
6?
there are 6.
6.
Apparently. 6 Scream movies, and so we will be seeing the 6th Scream movie on March 3rd, and the D&D movie pushed back to March 31st.
I have to wait even longer. That is painful. And you know what this means,
yep.
right?
And so what's the big joke? Yep.
They had to cancel game night and reschedule it, right? I mean, that's the clear joke that comes from this change. Yeah. They should have listened to Alex
Sorry,
Kammer.
We all can't get together that day. Yeah, exactly. They should have made 5 different movies and therefore shown a different one each week.
I like that.
So from the D&D movie to the original Forgotten Realms map, Ben Riggs, who was the author of Slaying the Dragon, A Secret History of Dungeons and Dragons, and also who appeared on our show a few months ago, went to the game hole and looked at the original map of the Forgotten Realms. And then he interviewed people who were involved with that map to hear the story behind it. And we have a link in our show notes to the blog post where Ben talks about the map and its history. And it's super fascinating, both as a fan of the game and as a game designer, to see where this map started in terms of what it is as a game. Yeah. And how it sort of changed. Like when the Moonshade Isles were added to the map, they just took the little map of the Moonshade Isles and taped it over the spot in the ocean where it was supposed to be, covering the other things that had been originally there.
I thought that was fantastic. Hilarious. And just the whole history of it, where it was in his cubicle when Jeff Grubb leaves TSR, and then this woman knows that, wait, this is important. I should really save this because, this is probably the only thing that records this type of change and how all this took place. And so smartly ends up being protected and kept. And then at a time when a lot of things were being just thrown out due to lack of storage space. And so then Alex Kammer ends up buying in, and he, you and I have both seen it at the game hole. It's fascinating to look at that and all the handwriting, and then he went through all this process to preserve it because it's complicated. It's not just paper; it's paper with like tape over it, and so you have to neutralize the acids and problems with the glue and things. So he went through quite the process to protect this so it'll last as long as it can.
Yep. It is called the Martin map because it was Susan Martin who saved it from being just junked when TSR was purchased and everyone moved to Seattle to become part of Wizards of the Coast. So if you're into D&D history, Ben's book is great, obviously, but his blog articles that touch on these smaller things in the history of D&D are a great read. So you should check that out.
Thank you, Susan.
Checking out Roll20. Their year in review is up on their blog at roll20.net, but they talk about things that they did and did not do in 2020. Teos, what were some of the highlights for you?
Yeah, so the big one is Roll20 and One Bookshelf becoming one company, with basically Roll20 buying One Bookshelf. We get an overview of that, but we're also told, which I thought was interesting, that we're going to hear more ways the two are working together in early 2023. And that right there was for me like, oh, okay, I'm ready. Tell me more. They also review the features they've added: 50% faster load times, 50% of games will load in under 4 seconds, dark mode, one-way and transparent barriers, token control, PDFs on the VTT, mobile app updates, and more. All of that, to me, what it really says is this is a company that, unlike in previous years where they were kind of like, hey, plodding along, just doing stuff, this is a company that sees we have competitors, we have to be in this space protecting it and engaging people, right? There are other VTTs, there are D&D Beyonds and Wizards of the Coasts to kind of outmaneuver, right? You've got to hustle, and this is a company that's hustling, which is great for anybody who uses the platform. So they talked about future updates. You were going to say something to that?
No, I was going to say, going back to this whole idea of getting your gaming group together, we finally come to the realization, I think, in our group that while we do not enjoy playing via VTTs and not in person, at some points we're going to have to if we're going to have a campaign that succeeds. We can't meet even every other week. So I've been digging back into Roll20 and trying to reteach myself how to use it. So all of this information is becoming valuable, and I think the recovery from the pandemic, if we are actually in a recovery or not, is a whole other question. But this is what we learned about gaming during the pandemic, and some of those lessons we're going to continue to linger in our gaming lives, despite people trying to return back to normal.
Yeah, no, for sure. I feel the same thing as well, where I think getting my group to meet in person is a little bit harder than getting them to play online. And so playing online is the clear way to go, right? It's the path to victory. And so all these improvements matter to me. And they've got future improvements as well that they're promising. So I'm excited to see what 2023 brings as well. So I always appreciate their reviews.
For sure. Johnny Stanton has become the first NFL player to post something on the DMs Guild. What, you may ask? Who's Johnny Stanton? Well, he's been featured in Sports Illustrated and recently on an ESPN news segment for playing D&D with other NFL players. So he was a fullback for the Cleveland Browns, who got some very high-profile players to join his D&D game. And so that has been a topic of conversation in both football and gaming spheres. And what did he put up on the DMs Guild? He released a subclass for paladins called the Oath of the Executioner. The Oath of the Executioner is taken up by those dedicated to justice of the highest order. Practiced in making death a quick, painless experience, the Executioner will not hesitate to make the decisive blow on their target. So, it's celebrities playing D&D is always a big thing, and so the sports fanatics who, there is some overlap between sports fanatics and gaming fanatics. So it's good to have another celebrity, especially in that arena, step up. What else has been news about Johnny Stanton?
So he launched a new website where he says professional athlete, Dungeons and Dragons nerd, which I thought was awesome. And it has a special Johnny Stanton set of dice that are all kind of gold with blue, and has his insignia on it, t-shirts, and then he has contact information for collaborations. So, maybe that's the way you want to go. I think he's already learning about how hard it is to make a successful product on the DM's Guild. His product is not copper yet, but I hope it will be. I'm pulling for him. I think this is great, and I hope more people who are in non-traditional walks of life, right, can embrace that nerddom and be a part of D&D and RPG communities. So I'm all for it. But it's easy. Yeah, it's not easy, right? It doesn't kind of. Yeah. Especially, I think when your audience is a certain type of audience, bringing them to this new audience or gaining a new audience in this space can be challenging. So.
Yeah, it's different to get attention in the realm than it is to sell products in the realm. It's definitely a thing. But as I wear D&D apparel around town, and I live in a pretty small town, I am constantly running into people who are like, oh, I love D&D. And I'll be like, yeah, me too. I play a lot, and I make games and stuff. And they're like, really? Oh, I wish I could do that. I would quit my job right now to become a game designer. Wow. And I'm like, yes, a lot of people would. And I hope that you are able to do so as well.
That's really fascinating. I've not heard a lot of that, but then I'm always surprised. Like, we just had a restaurant in town that got bought out by a new group that is launching a tavern that is all RPG themed, and they are kickstarting their adventures that they're going to run at the tavern, and they're having to explain, no, if you don't play RPGs, you can still be a part of this. They're having to explain to the rest of the crowd, right? It's funny.
Yeah. So we go from the NFL to publishing advice from Sandy Pug Games. Sandy Pug Games has launched this site called the Sandy Pug School, which collects game design and publishing advice. Current articles include editing, different types of editing, and when to use them for your tabletop role-playing game projects. Being a leader without being a boss, which I was like, okay, I can see that. And 4 things everyone does on Kickstarter that you're afraid of doing. So I haven't seen this site yet, Teos. What do you think?
It's pretty neat. The being a leader without a boss was the one that first caught my eye, because it does speak to this situation that happens, especially in collaborations, or where you bring in freelancers, where you're kind of the boss, but not their boss, like in a traditional sense, right? And so what does that mean? How do you sort of lay down what needs to happen and motivate and coordinate, but you're not that boss figure that might be traditional, where people just blindly follow what you say because otherwise you're fired, right? And so it is an interesting where it's more about advocacy and encouraging and generating ideas and things like that. And so I think that was a pretty neat article.
Okay. And you can find that at sandypug.school. One of our favorite game designers has some new products out. James Introcaso has released for the Zweihander role-playing game Eternal Night of Lockwood, a 386-page adventure for the Zweihander RPG. And as Teos waves his copy of this book around, he can tell you that he had the pleasure of looking over this adventure. And what did you see when you did this look over?
It's amazing. First of all, it's enormous. Part of that is that Zweihander uses a larger typeface. So if you're used
Yeah.
to, say, like D&D adventures or a lot of other RPGs that have that kind of small type that people with bad eyesight complain about, this does not have that problem, and so it's bigger and thicker. And it's actually kind of nice because you can just kind of take in a thing at a time, and it's I like how it's spaced out. The layout is great. It's a beautiful book, beautiful cover. I love the map style inside. But all of it is a really neat adventure that's campaign length, where you are finding that the land is suddenly plunged into darkness, eternal darkness that never goes away, and the why of it. And there are really great creepy aspects to it. Things like, the mine that's almost out of copper, and what's going on in the mine. And then you go to other areas and they have equally sort of creepy pieces that just before you even get there, you as a player would be kind of like, oh, this is exciting and a little horrifying. And yeah, it's great. So even if you don't play Zweihander, I would check this out because it is a really neat concept and very easy to run with some other system if you wanted to. But yeah, excellent job by James and Picasso. I know he worked on it for a very long time too. It's cool.
And I think we talked about this before, but since it's sort of through the same publisher, I wanted to mention To Be or Not to Be a Villain, which James wrote with Rudy Basso. And it's the take on the role of a lifetime as one of 9 nobles in this tabletop role-playing game that retells Hamlet. Players cooperate and plot against one another for the throne of Denmark. And I know that works both with the Zweihander role-playing game and with 5e D&D. And I have pre-ordered it, but it doesn't come out until March, I think. So I'm waiting patiently to see what James and Rudy did with that.
Yeah, and as I said on the show, I play tested that, so I know it's really, really awesome. But I am also excited to get that into my hands. Maybe also worth mentioning that Into the Motherlands was, a huge successful Kickstarter, and it was recently said that the publisher for that will be the same publisher that does Zweihander, which is super cool. So we see, a number of ways that they're involved in the space, and that's pretty neat.
Yeah, I mean, you're looking at the SimonandSchuster.com website to order some of these, published books. So that's not a small publishing company that is getting into the role-playing game field.
Yeah, and that's all through Andrews McMeel Publishing, which is the Zweihander publisher that's also doing Into the Motherlands. But they work through their own sort of distribution with Simon and Schuster, which is pretty sweet. So that really, really makes a big difference for them.